G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today I'm reviewing the Creality K1 Max. Now the first thing people always want to know when you conduct a review is up front if you recommend it, and the answer is yes. But if you want to know more, keep watching because I'm going to explain everything in depth. Now, before we start, I review these printing units based on their application in miniatures modelling. Namely, I think that filament printers make the best cost-reward terrain possible for tabletop games. We're talking games like Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, Star Wars Legion, Song of Ice and Fire, things like that. And with that in mind, I'm more interested in something, printing for this niche rather than printing benchy boats and vases like other YouTubers, because those tests are not practical for what we want to use these machines for majority of the time. So with that out of the way, let's start the review proper. Now, first up, some specs on the machine. It can print a build volume of 300mm cubed, which is roughly equivalent to 12 inches cubed, so it's big. It's a decent volume. It attains this volume by also being a very large machine externally, 435mm by 462mm by 526mm, or 1.5 by 1.5 by almost 2 feet tall. Makes this quite a large unit. That big bed is driven by 3 Z-axis lead screws. They're conjoined by a belt on the underside to ensure some uniform movement. The printer itself is fully enclosed, featuring aluminium extrusions for the frame with acrylic side panels, a glass lid, and front door, and that front door's on pretty nice hinges as well. It also features a hexagonal, sort of honeycomb-like, molded plastic on the rear. This makes it a neat and sleek looking package, especially compared to something like the Creality X+3, which looks like a stormtrooper made love to a microwave. It features an internal cooling fan which blows air across the surface of the print, if turned on, for better cooling, but it looks cheap and tacky compared to the rest of this polished unit. It also features a decently sized extraction fan at the rear, which is used to pull through an activated carbon filter, which means way less fumes when printing. And whilst this is a welcome addition, I do want to strongly advise viewers that you have no way of telling when the carbon is fully saturated and therefore worn out, nor is it enough for manufacturing in materials such as A-butyl styrene, because ABS fumes are very nasty, and I would recommend actually fitting a hose to this unit and extracting from the printer directly outside the building. For use indoors with regular PLA, however, this is about as low fume as a printer can go, and I'll give it credit for that. Now, being a Core XY machine, it's able to move both of those axes, the X and the Y, at very rapid speeds of up to 600mm per second, with an acceleration of 20 meters per second, which is to say it picks up speed about twice as fast in any direction as if you drop something under the force of gravity. And whilst this can even be exceeded, I feel that this printer, like many, is pushing the material limits of its components in doing so. It's stretching belts, things like that, by rapidly changing direction. There is an upper limit to what you can get away with. I think realistically you should expect between 300 to 500mm per second in actual operation. The printing accuracy is rated to be a 1/10 of a millimeter. So 4/1000 of an inch. I found this to be true in practice, especially on round objects. However, with over extrusion on the corners, a common issue with all filament machines, if you're going to try and put a square peg in a square hole, as it were, you want to leave at least 2.5 times the gap you would if it was a cylinder. I recommend 0.25mm being the clearance required because parts are just fatter at the corners. The extruder is a dual gear drive unit, and it's a direct drive, so it's mounted onto the print head about 40mm above the nozzle, very, very close. This unit has been revised to its current condition, but its original configuration on the base model K1 was very difficult by all reports. And overall, I found it to be a more or less reliable, with some caveats that I'll get into later, unit. But I will address right now one issue I had, which was a very, very unique one. A filament clog in 2 positions, the nozzle throat, which is a piece of Bowden PTFE tube connecting to the extruder and the nozzle, and inside the extruder itself. I had to pull a lot of parts off for this, And if you're not comfortable pulling apart a printer or performing fault diagnosis, this would be the end game right here for you. This is important because the regular person who's not done printing before, this is the sort of thing that will just kill it for them right here. Just look at how much of this unit I had to dismantle to get to the areas of concern to flush the system. In the end, I found the extruder had wound a piece of filament around the dual drive wheels, much to my surprise, as I've never had this occurrence. Being an engineer, I decided to try and replicate the fault, and I was able to do so successfully. Here is a quick 3D mock-up which is broadly similar in appearance to the printer. Now, the printer's filament, normally this red tube here, should be able to pass up and down a straight line through the two wheels and into a hole located in the base. That's fine when it's working correctly. However, with a blockage in the throat, the filament here actually bent in half, more like this piece. And once it bent in half, once that material had given way and started moving sideways, the rotating gears started to spin that filament and pulled it further around sideways in this new direction until it became so excessive that it actually snapped the filament and left me with one piece of bent filament going down through the throat, down through that hole, and another piece of filament neatly wrapped like a tire around a wheel. I was able to replicate this on a test bench by using a piece of PTFE which I deliberately clogged up, and it took several attempts to make it work. Although a major fault and catastrophic to a user unused to printers, it was more of a tedious repair than a difficult one, and only occurred once in the first machine over 6 weeks of running. Oh, that's right, by the way. I said the first machine because Creality sent me a machine, but I also acquired and set up a second machine. Why? Well, for a start, I'm always looking at ways to improve my print farm, and 2 fast, large enclosed units seems like a smart idea. Secondly, it allowed me to have a better sample pool to pull from. Some users will complain about the quality of Creality printers, how bad items are out of the box. Me though, I've never had an issue with any of their printers. I'm up to at least 15 different types of printer from Creality, and that's over about 6 years or so. So more printers means more chance at a fault was my thinking here. Now the only faults I had were 2 prints early on due to a Bowden issue, which again I'll get into, on the same unit, and it was the same unit that had this extruder clog. So that's 3 issues in over 1,000 hours of running spread out between the 2 machines. That's 3 faults. I could have just got really lucky here, but considering how little I had to do to maintain their performance, simply lubricating the machines occasionally, I didn't even clean the bed. Speaking of the print surface, the smooth PEI plates, they haven't required anything to help them stick so far, and the bed leveling has worked flawlessly. I ran calibrations on nearly every print just to see if the unit would get it wrong. Occasionally, I didn't run the calibration to see if things had moved during the print and the printer would get it wrong. Neither of these things happened. I also updated the firmware on one of the printers and ran the other one with outdated firmware for 4 weeks. Neither of the firmware caused issues. Neither one of them, however, used their LiDAR particularly efficiently, nor did they seem to use the camera to check the prints. Now they have a built-in LiDAR that's supposed to be a quality of life feature to scan the layers and find issues, but in all 3 of those failed prints, none of them successfully were picked up or stopped by the printers, which has left me a bit unimpressed with that feature. The unit does come with a nifty little camera, but I haven't utilised it yet as internet connectivity isn't sorted in my workshop, so sadly no time lapses just yet. Let's talk issues with the machines now. Now that first one obviously is out of the way with that extruder clog, very rare, I've never seen it before, like I said, six odd years, never seen it, but it happened. But with this machine, the first one, the biggest one that really stood out to me is the spool placement. Now, I understand why they do this. I understand why engineers make these decisions. I am one. But all of these engineers place the filament spools behind these machines, with tubes feeding into the back in annoying ways. This unit, as stated earlier, is about as deep as your fingertip to your elbow. So when it's sitting on a shelf, how do you reach behind it effectively? I can tell you, you can't do it with both arms. So you're already an arm down. You can't reach around with both hands and touch fingers at the back. It's just impossible unless you're some gigantic human or weirdly proportioned. On top of that, that one hand you now have has to reach around the back, pull the old filament spool off, place the new spool on, undo the spool, clip the end of the spool, find the feed tube, then feed manually up the tube and into a sensor. The sensor is designed to pause prints when you run out of material, and it worked perfectly on both printers, I'll credit. Once you pass through this sensor, which may require you to remove the Bowden tube and to aim the filament up the spout yourself, you have to feed all the way to the extruder located in the print end. This last couple of inches into the print head is, well, it's frustrating, as there's a very tight greater than 9-degree bend here and the filament wants to stay straight. So as it passes into this air fitting, it has a habit to catch on the sides and to not guide down a very narrow gap. It's only 1.8 millimeters in between the rollers. That's about 72 thousandths of an inch for those using the hamburgers and heart disease scale. So to make it work, I had to remove the tube and then feed about 50 millimeters or 2 inches of filament out, and then guide it in manually before I then reseat the tube and lock the extruder. After this, you can hit the extrude button on the interface, which is a wonderful little touchscreen unit, superior to Bamboo Labs units, which are the competitors I'll come back to later. The extrude function will heat up the nozzle to 240 degrees Celsius, and then it will purge the nozzle automatically. You can quickly figure out if you didn't do things correctly because nothing will come out if you didn't get the material into the extruder. Additionally, the machine comes with a glass lid on top, which encloses the unit, which is, great. However, it presses against the feeding tube and tightens it, tightening the bend into the top of the extruder. Remember, this material wanted to stay straight and now you're bending it very sharply. So I'm using my finger here in the video to touch the front and rear of the machine and bring my camera down parallel with the unit, and you can clearly make out that the Bowden tube, it sticks up proud of the surface. This particular issue led to both of my original print failures and may have contributed to that major extruder clog. When printing PLA, you won't have the lid on as advised by the company, so because it will get too hot. But then where does it go? It isn't hinged, it doesn't have a prop, and it hits the tube. So you need a solution, and the solution I found was a file by Philips 3D on Colts 3D. I had many to pick from, but I chose this particular one because I liked the features on it, which lifted the lid up by about 70 millimeters, as well as providing sliding ventilation, which means I don't have to remove that glass lid at all, except for when I'm changing out the filament. Even when I'm printing on a hot day, I just open up all the vents. No screws, no fittings required. Plastic straight out of the printer. You can print it all on the printer in about 2 days. Awesome. So, with the lid and feeding problem solved, how did I tackle the filament spool location? Well, I originally intended to use a printed spool holder that went onto the side of the machine. But then the light bulb went off. I'm wanting a controlled environment. Maybe using some exotic materials from time to time for my engineering work. I even have some fiberglass mold making using 3D prints coming up, so I decided to buy a relatively cheap filament dry box on Amazon. The unit's from Congro, which isn't important, works well by the way. It doesn't matter who makes it though, only matters that it performs the task. And I added some PTFE tubes to it and some fittings to hold them in place. And now I feed my filament directly from the front of the machine, guided smoothly along the tube, directly to the runout sensor. This has completely solved all of the problems of having to reach behind the machine and feed everything, and all it cost me is a little length of PTFE tube, about $2 or $3 worth, and about a $50 dry box on the front. So, that's not much in the scheme of things. Now, this problem solved this perfectly solved all of my problems, but I have to ask, why is it that I'm having to make the modifications? This machine is for high-speed printing. It's a flagship product. It's advertised as such from the company. It's an expensive machine. You know, I know, and they know it will use up material fast, especially when printing at high speeds. So why on earth would anyone want to mess around with reaching materials at the rear all of the time? It's a 1,500 Australian dollar machine at the time of recording. Just add a little hotbox on the side of it, please, Creality, on a little flexible tube. And whilst you're at it, please move the touchscreen to the top of the unit so it doesn't require the door to have a weird little cutout around it. Now, apart from these issues, the printer functioned flawlessly. It's not even that noisy thanks to being enclosed. I'm very happy overall with the performance. But the solutions I came up with shouldn't have been operator level in the first place. If I buy a paper printer from an office supplier and I had to pick up a 20 kilogram or 48 pound printer every time I needed to add in A4 paper, I think I'd grow very tired of that very quickly. Maybe I'm wrong on this front, but viewers, you tell me your thoughts below. Now, let's talk about software. I'd like to show you Creality Print, but on the computer I use for editing and digital design work, I get this message. Well, thanks. I have a GeForce RTX 4070 Ti graphics card. I know many people don't speak computerese, but what that means is it's good. It's easily a top 10 graphics card, right? Top 10 of what you can buy on the market. And it gets regular driver updates from NVIDIA because it is a new graphics card. The issue isn't the drivers at all. It's an optimization issue where the program and the computer just don't like each other. So instead, I did my slicing on another computer, which is a pretty high-end laptop, only about 3 years old. Now, this laptop suffers constant crashes to desktop in Creality Print, which is their proprietary slicing software they included, which makes me think it's unstable, especially because on that same computer, I've used Cura, I've used HelloBox, Jitterbox, Anycubic, Slicer, Lychee, and others with no issues. So after running a few parts with Creality Print, I grew pretty sick of it. I started using the program I will suggest to any filament print user, which is Orca Slicer. It's a growth of Bamboo Slicer, which was based on Prusa Slicer. It's free, you can make an account, but you don't need to, and it's simply amazing. So much so that I'll probably give it its own episode in time. But I always test the supplied programs because that's what the user will expect. And people who've never done printing before, they get this thing out of the box, they're going to go with the recommended program from the manufacturer. And I don't recommend it in this case. Creality Slicer worked well enough when it did work, but otherwise I'm going to say just use Orca, you'll thank me later. I'll also take the time to mention that although these units have good wireless internet connectivity, when you hook it up, as I currently don't, it's easy to set up, nothing requires you to do so, meaning you can work entirely offline with the unit. If you value your data privacy, which I do, then you're really going to appreciate it. Creality providing all of their units with unlocked firmware, Clipper in this case, along with very customer-friendly features like data privacy, I really have to applaud that, as competitors with similar machines, like at market-leading Bamboo Labs P1S, which forces you to do things you don't want, is full of proprietary parts which hurt in comparison, man, Creality really wins out here. And in fact, this is probably a good time to bring up that comparison because at least during the time recording, the P1S is the same price as the K1 Max. So who wins out? Well, the P1S has 4 filament rolls stored on its AMS unit in the top of the printer. That's pretty damn superior to Creality's single spool on the back. P1S also offers multicolor or multi-material printing with excessive waste, I'll add, and it's kind of a gimmick that has very little actual usability, but if you want that feature, well, Creality doesn't do it. So that's 2 points to Bamboo. Bamboo has good reliability. They're renowned for it, in fact. Creality supposedly has a spotty record, but as I pointed out, at well over 1,000 hours of running time on 2 different units, let alone my other units, I think reliability's fine. No issues on these printers that are different to issues I've had anywhere else. I think filament printers run into the same problems across all brands. It's just the luck of the draw what you get. Because I've had 1,000 hours of issue-free printing, I'm going to call this a draw because I think the build quality is fine here. Slicing software, well, Bamboo, straight out of the box, they have the better slicer by a mile. But since this video recommends Orca, well, you as a user who's going to download Orca after this is a non-issue. Let's give a point to Bamboo Labs here anyway for winning with the default. So that's 3-0 in Bamboo's favour so far. What about the setup time? Well, both machines come mostly assembled. Setup time is only a few screws with instructions provided on the screen by Creality, which I'm going to say cinches it slightly for them in their favour. So 3-1, still very much Bamboo's game. Print bed size, massively superior on the Creality. You're getting 100mm in every direction extra, so that's a clear win to them, 3-2. Creality is also using very few proprietary parts. They're on there, but most of the stuff on the machine can be bought for very cheap online, where Bamboo mostly requires you to buy directly from them at their prices. That's 3-all. User interface. Well, the Bamboo interface wouldn't be out of place on a printer 6 years ago, whilst Creality has a full touchscreen unit with graphical representation of the print you're doing. Hands down win to Creality here, although I want to point out that the PandaPad upgrade to the P1S, P1P, X1C is a god tier improvement on those machines. 3-4. Now, Creality has taken the lead here. Picking up layer adhesion issues though, P1S wins out here as my Creality unit failed to stop on those 3 bad prints. So that's 4-all. That's a complete tie in all the categories that sort of matter here. So it's a tie for me right now on the better unit, which is interesting. So I'll say this, if you want more versatility out of the box, the ability to print with multiple materials, multiple different colors, then Bamboo Labs would be the way to go. But if you want a larger machine with cheaper spare parts, something that's easier to modify, then the Creality K1 Max is going to dominate the opposition utterly here. It's really up to what you prefer out of the two. Me, I prefer the Creality K1 Max because I like printing large terrain pieces, and I know if I was to go down, say, the cosplay route at some point, then I can print much larger pieces on that K1 Max than I ever could on the P1S. Reliability-wise, I can't stress this enough, I had no issues with the K1 Max after fixing that feeding, to the point where I would put on a 17-hour print and not even check on it once. I just knew that after a month of no failures, it was just going to work first time. And it did so every time. I cannot give a higher praise than that because that's never happened with my printers ever. Now, print quality, everyone's favorite. Let's take a look at some of the terrain I've been working on. I've been making a table of silos from the Damocles set by Sacris Mundus, as well as testing out some files for a long-time collaborator, War Scenery, who's launching a Kickstarter very soon, and that's where the Gothic walls came from in here. Do note that the floors were glued in separately. So that takes us to the end, and overall, what do I think? Well, you know by now that I had issues with it. It's an expensive unit. Mind you, at $1,000 cheaper than the currently seemingly pretty Ford Prusa XL, which requires a lot of assembly, I'll add, whilst being fully enclosed and wickedly fast, it's actually quite the budget machine for what it is. For making terrain for my tables, it's an utter beast, pumping out a full table per machine in just a couple of weeks, alongside all the other projects I've had on. So I heartily recommend it for those getting into printing with big size, high speed. It may even, with a few small modifications, such as upgrading the hot end in line with the K1C, be suitable for a host of materials and allow this printer to be a genuine all-rounder for several years to come. It's neat, it's well packaged, has no loose wires floating around, and is a genuinely brilliant machine. Let down only by the filament feed system and that glass lid interfering with that feed system. So that's why Creality gets a fully approved thumbs up for providing 1,000 hours of trouble-free printing, but, and I can't stress this enough, only after I made those changes to the machines. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching this review, and please leave your thoughts and comments in the comments section below the video. If you're interested in picking up one of these machines, I'm going to put a couple of links in the video description. I don't make anything out of you clicking on these links. I've refused to be an affiliate partner for that because I want my reviews to remain unbiased, where I don't get any financial gain from actually, talking about these machines. There's nothing in it for me. So if I give something a good rating, I'm not giving it a good rating because I'm getting anything out of it. I'm giving it a good rating because I genuinely think it's good. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.